Hey everybody, welcome to The Bottom Line. Boy, am I excited tonight. Tonight I'm gonna give you my rankings on the 8 studio albums by the mighty, the magnificent, and yes, sometimes mystic, Led Zeppelin. Led Zeppelin formed in 1968, originally as the New Yardbirds. More on that in a future video. They recorded their first album, self-titled Led Zeppelin. They followed that with Led Zeppelin 2, Led Zeppelin 3, and their first unnamed album, generally referred to as Led Zeppelin 4, but also known by some fans as either Zoso or Four Symbols. They followed that album with their first album that actually had a title, and that of course was Houses of the Holy. Of course, they followed that up with the magnificent double album Physical Graffiti, followed by the album Presence, and of course finally recording and releasing their final album In Through the Outdoor. Now it's important to remember, Led Zeppelin weren't just the heirs apparent to the Beatles. They, like the Beatles in the 60s, would be the prominent rock act in the world throughout the 70s. And like the Beatles, Led Zeppelin, with each and every album, presented us with a broader and more eclectic musical picture. Many people refer to Led Zeppelin as the first heavy metal band. But is that true? Or are they, like Richard Cole, their tour manager, once described them, the world's heaviest folk band? A case could be made for either or for both as far as I'm concerned. Okay, so with my rankings tonight, we're going to start with number 8 and work our way up to number 1. Now, personally speaking, number 8 is pretty easy for me to rank. Numbers 7 through 1, they get a whole lot more difficult. And of course, number 8 for me would be their very last album, In Through the Outdoor. Now don't get me wrong, there's no such thing as a bad Led Zeppelin album as far as I'm concerned. And it's true, in this album we hear new ground explored. But unfortunately, after the release of this album, their drummer, John Bonham, died. And the resulting album sounds more like the post-Led Zeppelin careers of its individual members than it does a pure Led Zeppelin album. Had Led Zeppelin continued to explore these themes that they explore in this album, it might be ranked higher. But with the death of John Bonham, we'll never know. Now, number 7, there's going to be a lot of disagreement with this, but like I said, please remember, these 7 albums are so close as far as I'm concerned, ranking them is damn near impossible. But one of them has got to slip into the uncomfortable number 7 position. And for me, that's their sophomore effort, Led Zeppelin 2. Now, there's absolutely nothing wrong with this album. As a matter of fact, some people even think it's a better version of their first album. It certainly continues to explore the areas that they explored in their first album, and it does it very, very well. But the reason that I put it at number 7 is it is the least forward-thinking album that I can think of that Led Zeppelin put together. This album's identity relies a little bit on the identity of their first album, if you ask me. Okay, now for me, we have to discuss position 6 and 5 a bit together. And for me, believe it or not, the 2 albums that fit in this spot are Houses of the Holy and Presence. You know, when I was first compiling this list over the last couple of weeks, these 2 positions were switched. I have changed my mind, and because of that, number 6 is Houses of the Holy. Now, a lot of Zeppelin fans might be seething about now because usually the album Presence doesn't rank as high as I've given it tonight. And before I explain why I ranked it so high, let's discuss number 6 itself, Houses of the Holy. Now, Houses of the Holy, for me, for years, was the ultimate Led Zeppelin album. It was actually the first Led Zeppelin album that I personally purchased. But when I bought this album, within 1 month, I had the entire collection up to and including Houses of the Holy. To me, this is a wonderful album, and in future videos, we'll give more time to each and every album. But why would I rank the Presence album number 5? Well, first of all, it's pretty easy. From the moment I bought this album, which was when it was first released, I loved this album. Critics at the time weren't too impressed with this album. The album, first of all, was recorded in only a period of 3 weeks, a record for Led Zeppelin, discounting, of course, their first album. And I don't know why this album has ever received even a hint of negative criticism. With the exception of one track, Candy Store Rock, John Bonham is right up front in your face with Jimmy Page, and the interplay between these two on this album, I tell you, I still listen to this album every week. I love it. And you know, Bonham is just so much at his very best here. And as far as I'm concerned, he is the best drummer in rock and roll. Now, on the cut Candy Store Rock, he's brought down in the mix for a very good reason. And if you give it a good listen, you'll see that their use of reverbs, they were trying to achieve a sound. And so his level went down to represent that style of music. But all in all, as far as I'm concerned, Presence is a masterpiece. Now, of course, that brings us to number 4. Which of Led Zeppelin's albums didn't make the top 3? Well, believe it or not, as far as I'm concerned, that would have to be Led Zeppelin 3. Now, this was another difficult album for me to place, and I'll tell you why. Because in my head, after the release of Led Zeppelin 2, we were expecting more of the same, right? Instead, we get a very eclectic album with a mix of heavy rock on one side and acoustic folk music on the other. Now, this album, the critics liked a whole lot, and some of the fans didn't at the time. But really, this is the album that would identify where Led Zeppelin was going. Okay, so now we're up to the big 3, and I think a lot of people would rank my number 3 as their number 1 choice album. And that, of course, is the magnificent Physical Graffiti, Led Zeppelin's double album, and perhaps their most eclectic album of all. On this album, they took recordings of past tracks that hadn't been included on previous albums, as well as brand new written material, and somehow blended this eclectic mess into a magnificent album. You know, after hearing Kashmir on the radio, I didn't even bat an eyelash at the heavy price that I would have to pay for that double album. I immediately went out and purchased the first of many copies I've owned of that album over the years. All right, so that leaves the remaining 2 albums for me to place at number 1 and number 2. First, number 2, and that is Led Zeppelin's very first album, Led Zeppelin. Now, I know a lot of people wouldn't rank this album quite this high, but you know, this album, it has a punch, and part of that is the very small amp that Jimmy Page chose to record this album with. You know, we have discussed in past videos how the Beatles recorded their very first album, Please Please Me, in less than 13 hours, less than 24 if you include the time that it took to record the 4 songs that were already in the can when they recorded the remaining 10. Led Zeppelin nearly duplicates that feat with their first album. Financed mainly by Jimmy Page himself, the band was on nearly as tight a schedule as the Beatles were when they recorded their first album. And believe it or not, they managed to record this wonderful album in 30 hours. To this very day, as far as I'm concerned, this album sounds as fresh as the day it came out. Well, that leaves number 1, and it's probably not a surprise to many people. This album is number 1 on a whole lot of Led Zeppelin fans' list. And you know, with my personality, I almost want to pick another album, to be honest with you. This is just too obvious, but not to rank this album at number 1 would be a fool's barren at best. And that, of course, is what most fans call Led Zeppelin 4. The impact of this album is closer to the impact that Michael Jackson's Thriller would have a decade later. And don't forget, Stairway to Heaven was never issued really as a single, but here in the United States, at least in the Bay Area here on the West Coast, Stairway to Heaven was played even on AM radio. And of course, the second you turned on FM radio, you were inundated with this song. And as great as this song is, it's not even my favorite cut on the album, not by far. And that's how powerful this album is, with cuts like Black Dog, Rock and Roll, and the more Celtic influenced, softer songs on this album. It just has a presence really, that it is its own identity.